It's the 2022 playoffs, and we've got this first round matchup between the Golden State Warriors and the Denver Nuggets. It's game 1 and Steph Curry isn't in the starting lineup. He's only just returning from injury, so it's Jordan Poole in his place. Once the game starts and we see Curry check in for the first time, unsurprisingly, it is for Jordan Poole. But then in the second quarter, we see something we've never seen before and the Warriors are yet to experience. The Warriors' typical starters are out there: Curry, Klay, Wiggins, Draymond, Looney. Jordan Poole's checking into the game, but he isn't checking in for Curry, Klay, or even Andrew Wiggins. It's Kevon Looney going to the bench. This is the first time we see the death lineup take the court together. It would have likely happened much earlier, but due to injuries, this group had really only played a few games together since Klay's return. But now we're seeing it. And not just that, in a key moment of the game. They're down 43-40 after a slow offensive start. They didn't have a big lead and were just trying something out. They targeted this lineup combination. And well, it worked. It worked perfectly. When Poole checks into the game, there's 4 minutes and 24 seconds left in the quarter. By the halftime break, the Warriors are up 58-47. They outscored Denver 18-4 with all 3 of Curry, Klay, and Poole involved, hitting at least 2 shots apiece. Impressive. But we're gonna have to see a little more in order for a name like the death lineup to really stick. And so game 2 comes along. Again, we're in the second quarter. This time it's Bjelica and Porter Jr. out. The Splash Brothers are coming in, joining Wiggins, Draymond, and Poole. The death lineup is back. Once again, they've started off slow offensively, at least by their standard. They're down 43-35. But then in the 5 minutes in which this lineup's out there, it's Klay, then Curry, then Poole. Again, everyone is getting involved. The offense is on fire. By the time Draymond is subbed out with 57 seconds to go till half, the death lineup had scored 22 points. They'd gone from an 8-point deficit to an 11-point lead of 57-46. We see the lineup again briefly the following quarter. Curry scores 5 points in 2 possessions before everyone subbed out. And so just like that, it only took 11 minutes on the court together for the NBA world to explode. The analytics crowd is drooling over the advanced stats. The Jordan Poole loving, TikTok watching kids are screaming about how obvious this should have been. Again, in just 11 minutes, the death lineup was cemented. Now, this really wasn't anything new for Steve Kerr and the Warriors. They're highly credited for popularizing small ball in the modern era. For Golden State, this really just meant any lineup that featured Draymond Green at the 5. But a huge difference between those death lineups of old and this one is the skill set of those guys in between the Splash Brothers and Draymond. From 2014 to 2016, it was Harrison Barnes and Iguodala. From 2016 to 2019, it was Iguodala and Kevin Durant. While come the time this new Jordan Poole, Andrew Wiggins version took the court, Wiggins had cemented himself as an elite defender, at least in the present. There's a big difference between Jordan Poole and guys like Iguodala, Durant, and Barnes. I don't think there's going to be a more polar player than Jordan Poole this season. Why? Because he's about to go off, at least in the box score. I'm going with him to average more than 24.4 points this season with the Wizards. This is one of the 6 squares I'm going with for my season-long Prize Picks entry, the sponsor for today's video. I'm on Prize Picks all season long. You basically just choose more or less on stats, and you can win up to 25 times your entry. They've got pretty much every sport, but for my season-long NBA entry, I went with a flex play. I only need 4 of the 6 to win. All happen, my $50 becomes $1,250. I ended up going with a lot of new faces. I'm pairing up that Jordan Poole square with Tyus Jones assists. I'm taking the Rookie of the Year battle. Give me more than Wemby points at 17 and Chet at 13.2. I then paired Chet with Giddy assists, hoping that pick and pop is as lethal as I think it'll be. And then lastly, I'm going with Chris Paul under 1 30-point game. He's not doing it. Now, Prize Picks is just for entertainment. It should be played responsibly, but it is by far my favorite way to have some action on the games. So if you guys are interested in giving it a shot, if you go to my link in the description and use code JIMMER when you sign up, they're going to give you an instant deposit match up to $100. Thank you, Prize Picks, for sponsoring. Also, I've been thinking about streaming on Twitch to sweat out some of these entries during the season. Let me know if that's something I should do. Another significant change is to a foundational piece of all these lineups, Klay Thompson. After back-to-back significant injuries, he wasn't bringing nearly the level of defense he had brought to those previous death lineups. But while this might have been the worst defensive version, at least in those 11 minutes, it looked like it might be bringing more offense than ever. If that's the case, it could be a legitimate weapon for the Warriors, in scenarios like the one they were in when we saw it for the first time. Slow offensive nights when you're looking for a spark at the end of the quarter. But that's not what we saw. Instead, we see the Warriors come back to the death lineup and back to it a lot throughout the playoffs. The Jordan Poole death lineup would take the court at some point in every single game during that Denver series. They played a total of 39 minutes, ending tied for the Warriors' most common 5-man group. Now the lineup cooled down. After posting a 204 offensive rating in those first 11 minutes, nearly double league average, it finished with a 141 offensive rating and a 120 defensive rating. The offense was still absurd, and unsurprisingly, the defense was below average. But with a net rating of 21, that didn't matter. They advanced to play the Grizzlies in round 2, and we actually see them open the series with a death lineup variation, this one featuring Gary Payton instead of Jordan Poole in place of Kevon Looney. But then we see Gary Payton go down with injury just minutes into game 2, so once again the death lineup is going to be featured and featured heavily. In fact, for the second series in a row, it played more minutes than any other Warriors lineup. This time, however, things didn't go nearly as well. The lineup struggled offensively, going 6 for 28 from 3 and finished the series with a negative net rating. As the series went deeper, we were actually seeing them go further away from these types of lineups and expand what had been a declining role for Kevon Looney. They end up winning that series once again and advance to the Western Conference Finals, this time facing off with the Dallas Mavericks, and after a down round 2 for the death lineup, they decided to come back with a vengeance. While this would be the first series so far that the starters eclipsed the death lineup in time played, they were right behind. They played 24 minutes, posting an even better offensive rating than they did in round 1, 149, expanding to all the lineup configurations around that trio of Curry, Klay, and Poole, which we saw 45 minutes of. They still maintained an insane 143 offensive rating. Once again, the defense struggled, but as long as the offense was going to be like that, no one cared. They win the series and advance to the finals. They're going to be facing off with the Boston Celtics, easily the biggest test for the death lineup to date. And sadly, Kerr kind of avoided the lineup. We would see it for the first time during a huge point in game 1, 4 minutes to go in the fourth, down by 6. Unfortunately though, 2 minutes later that deficit had gone to 12. And so with the return of Gary Payton only expediting the process, the lineup would never take the court for more than a minute or two the rest of the series. They finished with just 10 minutes played and a negative 4.5 net rating. It also wasn't just this specific lineup. We saw playoff low minutes for that Curry, Klay, Poole combo. They only played 32. And of any of the trios that played at least 30 minutes together for the Warriors, which there were 27 of, that trio finished with by far the worst net rating at negative 18.8. It was a great run for the Poole death lineup, but at the biggest moment of the season, it had become unplayable. When it was all said and done, it had played 19 games together, a total of 105 minutes, had a 123 offensive rating, a 109 defensive rating, and a 13.8 net rating. But probably a better synopsis is that the lineup dominated against Dallas and Denver, Will Barton, Monte Morris, Luka Doncic, Jalen Brunson, a group nothing notable to say the least defensively, but struggled against top defensive units like Boston and Memphis. The offseason goes by. They lose Otto Porter and Gary Payton, bring in Donte DiVincenzo. The biggest news from the offseason, however, was Draymond Green punching his fellow death lineup member Jordan Poole in the face, then Poole signing a max extension shortly after. All this happening just weeks before the start of the season, a season that didn't go quite as expected. They struggled away from their home court and didn't have Wiggins for over half the season. But what about the death lineup? Well, that didn't go great either. Despite injured Wiggins only playing 37 games, they would take the court together for 24 of those 27 games. They played the third most minutes of any Warriors 5-man group. The most common lineup was their starting unit. They finished with 331 minutes played and a really impressive 22 net rating. To get an idea of just how impressive that is at that kind of sample, this was the best starting unit. Not just that, the best 5-man lineup featured even somewhat significantly by any team in the entire league based on net rating. The next closest being the Nuggets starters at 13.1. Potentially even crazier is that the Warriors' second most common lineup, just DiVincenzo in place for Wiggins, a lineup we saw a lot throughout his time away from the team. They played 170 minutes together and finished with a just as impressive 20 net rating. Across the entire league, there were 57 lineups that played at least 160 minutes together. The top 2 were these Warriors lineups. The third most common was indeed the death lineup. They were just behind at 155 minutes together. They actually started 4 games in which the Warriors went 1-3, and on the season, the group finished with a brutal negative 2.4 net rating. That's legitimately one of the worst 5-man groups in the league. And just like we saw with DiVincenzo in place for Wiggins in the starters, we saw him in place for Wiggins in the death lineup, a group that finished with the 4th most minutes played together. They saw similar results, a negative 0.5 net rating. Once again expanding to all the Curry, Klay, and Poole minutes together. That trio was by far the worst of any of the Warriors trios, finishing with a negative 5.5. The other 3 that finished negative all involved Jordan Poole. 2 of the 3, both Poole and Klay. It was undoubtedly a rough year for the death lineup. Potentially, the death lineup was indeed dying. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the lineup configuration. It was Jordan Poole. There's really no other way to put it other than the Jordan Poole we saw in 2022 was not the Jordan Poole we saw this past season. Whether the punch shattered the chemistry with his teammates or maybe he just didn't have the pressure to perform after getting paid. Whatever it was, he was not a positive for them this season. He went from 18 to 20 points a game, but he raised his turnovers, shot worse from the field, shot worse from three, and this lack of efficiency was consistent. There wasn't these great runs to make up for the hard times like we saw the year prior. Then the biggest concern, defense. He's always been terrible, borderline atrocious. But now that inability was comboed with what appeared to be zero effort on that end, this ends up producing nothing short of a liability. He managed career lows, which I didn't even know was possible for him, in defensive rating, defensive wins above replacement, the list goes on and on. Now, significant change to a roster can influence metrics like that. Losing Otto Porter, Gary Payton, not having Andrew Wiggins for most of the year caused the Warriors to struggle as a whole defensively. But sadly for Poole, that's not much of a defense, no pun intended. Even in these same exact lineup configurations we saw him in a year ago, both Poole's personal and this team's production on both ends were down significantly. Seeing this, at the deadline, the Warriors decided to make a deal with the Blazers to bring back Gary Payton, someone who could and was a year ago a hedge against Jordan Poole. The only problem, like Jordan Poole, Gary Payton wasn't the same player he was a year ago. He'd only played 15 games on the season due to an injury to his abductor, an injury that was so significant. The Warriors almost went back on the deal after discovering the severity during a physical, but they didn't end up doing that. He joined the team and managed to get back on the court for the playoffs, a postseason the Warriors would begin against the Sacramento Kings. In that singular series, Jordan Poole would produce shooting performances of 4 for 10, 1 for 7, 4 for 13, 4 for 12, 2 for 11. That level of play or lack thereof caused the death lineup to play just 7 minutes across 4 of the 7 total games in that series. Jordan Poole was a problem, but not their biggest. See, a year ago, they were able to seamlessly lower Poole's minutes, replacing it by raising Otto Porter's role slightly and Gary Payton significantly. But now there is no Otto Porter, and while yes, they managed to bring back Gary Payton, whether it was health or not, while his low volume, highly efficient offense really didn't waver, the team wasn't getting close to the defensive results it had previously gotten with him in place of Poole. So now we're seeing inconsistency in Poole's role, inconsistency in Payton's role. Jonathan Kuminga's gone from averaging 20 minutes a game during the regular season to not even seeing the court. DiVincenzo's struggling offensively the entire playoffs. The Warriors starters are fine, but nearly every single other lineup is just not working at all. So what do? Well, your guess was just as good as Steve Kerr's. JaMychal Green goes from no role to starting multiple games. After getting out of the first round in 7, Moses Moody gets his biggest role to date in round 2 versus the Lakers. He goes from playing 6 minutes in game 1 to 25 in game 2. It was a new starting lineup, a new rotation, basically every single game. If you take the averages of the entire playoff run, there was really only 3 significant roles off the bench. Jordan Poole, Donte DiVincenzo, and Gary Payton, the tallest of the bunch being 6'4". Yeah, that's a problem that was ultimately way too much to overcome. They might have had the best starting unit in the league statistically, but the inability to find success in nearly any other roster configuration outside of maybe DiVincenzo in place of Wiggins was their downfall. They lose to the Lakers in 6 games. They head to an offseason where they clearly have some needs to address. Luckily, however, it didn't seem like that was going to be too hard. The first move that seemed like a necessity was trading Jordan Poole, and it really wasn't long before that happened. They reach a deal with the Wizards that sends him in exchange for Chris Paul. Now, the Warriors also added in Patrick Baldwin, a second rounder, a top 20 protected pick in 2030, which is very likely just to become a second rounder. Those parts of the deal really represent very little value. Effectively, this was a 1-for-1 swap. Chris Paul for Jordan Poole. For the Warriors, just as much as the players mattered here, maybe even more so, the contracts mattered. They have a $500 million payroll due to the luxury tax. When you hear about the Warriors paying someone $30 million, for the most part, think of that costing $60 million. They face this payroll and we're just weeks away from Draymond hitting free agency, just a year away from Klay doing the same. For them, this trade was really going from a questionable 4-year max contract to a contract that was effectively a 1-year deal. It was that financial incentive in combination with what Paul could bring on the court in the present, at least compared to the other Jordan Poole trade scenarios that were possible for them. It was a good start to the offseason, depending on what happens next. We go to the NBA draft. They hold the 19th pick.
The Golden State Warriors select Brandon Pojemski from Santa Clara University.
An interesting selection. Pojemski's a great prospect. He's got a well-rounded game and is coming off a dominant sophomore year at Santa Clara. But he is another guard. You draft talent over fit every time, always, no matter what. So if he's the top guy on the board, you get him. It's just now there needs to be a clear focus in free agency beyond the backcourt. At this point, Wiggins, Looney, and Kuminga are the only non-guards on the roster. That's it. We reach free agency, and they quickly get a new deal done with Draymond that will keep him around for the next 4 years. That's huge. The best starting unit in the league stays intact, for now. But then they don't give the qualifying offer to Anthony Lamb. Donnie DiVincenzo signs with the Knicks. They sign Dario Saric and Corey Joseph. Come the end of the offseason, they're looking at a nearly identical group, excluding the swap of Jordan Poole for Chris Paul. A move that on paper looks scary, fun, exciting. Everyone's heard the stat that Chris Paul's made every single team he's gone to better. But we can't forget a couple of things here. The first being that Chris Paul is literally the second oldest player in the league. He's coming off a career low less than 14 points a game, an average that's actually more than any other point guard at that age ever. That's just as impressive as it is a warning sign. The list of players even making it to that age is low. Chris Paul has seen his production, both offensively and defensively, go down each of the last 4 seasons. He was about to be waived by the Suns. Phoenix was going to be able to escape the $60 million they owed him over the next 2 years if they did that by June. The only reason that didn't happen was because the Bradley Beal trade opportunity came about. Now, in the event he was waived, there would have been a ton of interest across the league. There's no question about that. But it gives you a good idea of where Chris Paul is in his career. To put it simply, this isn't the Chris Paul who was one of the best point guards in the league for a decade. This isn't even the same Chris Paul that joined the Suns a few years ago. And the range of outcomes for the player that he is this season is extremely wide. Not only is his age significant, but this is the oldest team in the league. Paul will turn 39 this season, Curry 36, Klay and Draymond 34. Then there's the talent that Chris Paul possesses. Most of his value comes as a primary ball handler and lead playmaker. He's proven capable of playing alongside other ball-dominant guards, Booker, Harden, Shea. But this is a role or skill set that the Steve Kerr Warriors haven't used before, or at least featured heavily. The team is centered around the off-ball movement of the entire team, but most notably Curry and Klay Thompson. If anyone's the point guard in terms of what we typically associate with that role offensively, it's Draymond. That's unlikely to change. Over the last few years, we've also seen Chris Paul become a very inconsistent shooter. We're just a season removed from him shooting less than 32% from 3 on the entire year. But when the deal first happened, it didn't seem like it would interfere with anything. It wouldn't interfere with the Warriors' offense that's dominated the last decade. It wouldn't interfere with what was quite literally the best starting unit in the league. He would be stepping into the Jordan Poole role off the bench. He would bring a lead playmaking skill set that Poole wasn't and the bench needed. This was also just the first move of the offseason. They still had time to address those glaring concerns. But they didn't end up addressing those in any significant way. And when you're dealing with players that have been at the top of the league for their entire career, so much so that their State Farm alter ego is just as recognizable, it's not easy to put these players in the role that's best. We saw this with Russell Westbrook and the Lakers, Carmelo and the Thunder. Reality of where these players are in their career can be a tough realization, and it looks like this situation is not going to be that different. He gave a very similar response to the one we saw from Carmelo 4 years ago when he was asked about coming off the bench.
Or even coming off the bench. And the second question is...
For me? Oh. I mean, I don't know where that started, where that came from. Hey, P, they said I got to come off the bench.
Off the bench, playing with the second unit that's a lot younger than the Warriors of the past have been with JK and Moses. Just what do you think of their depth, their bench players that you might be playing alongside?
You coaching?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what the situation is going to be yet. You know what I mean? So I think that'll be for us to figure out once we get going.
You've never come off the bench in your entire career. Is that something that you'd be willing to do?
Like I said, it'll be a conversation for us when camp starts or whatnot. But me and Steve have talked or whatnot. But that ain't something that you'd be like, "What up, man? Where you starting? You coming off?" You know what I mean? So I think we'll figure.
he completely avoids stating that this is something he's willing to do, and fires back with, "Are you the coach?" after the interviewer presumes he'd be coming off the bench. Now recently his tone has changed. Throughout media day, he's now gone the route of, "I will do what's best for winning." A clear PR answer, and this change of tone could potentially be because the threat of coming off the bench has changed since July when he was first asked about it. It's hard to say where his willingness really is, but regardless, him just not seeing that this is the clear, best path forward puts the Warriors in a tough spot. Draymond addressed that pretty well.
We did have the best starting lineup in the league, so you can't ignore that, and yet you can't ignore Chris Paul as Chris Paul. Like, he is very much so Chris Paul.
We still don't know who Steve Kerr's starters will be when this team is fully healthy. At the time of this recording, we've only seen one preseason game so far, and currently Draymond's out with injury. In the game, however, Chris Paul did replace Draymond in the starting unit. The question is, when Draymond returns, who is he coming in for? If anyone at all, we saw them experiment with that kind of rotation in the playoffs. What doesn't seem to be the question is that Chris Paul is a massive upgrade to Jordan Poole, not only to the team as a whole, but to the death lineup. A death lineup that has a median age of 33, so the near NBA death lineup might be a more fitting name. But nevertheless, while Chris Paul is by no means the defender he once was, he is incomparable to Jordan Poole, and it might be just enough for the lineup to once again net out positively and be a tool for them this season. Now, whether or not that's the case, whether or not Chris Paul is a starter, that death lineup and small variations from it is going to be out there a lot and featured heavily this season. The roster just doesn't have the ability for that not to be the case. The near death lineup is inevitable. More evidence of this is Steve Kerr recently trying to address the defensive deficits of those lineups. Over the last couple weeks, he's been talking about Klay spending time at the 4. Something that in theory makes sense given how weak the position is across the league. In many offenses, it's a spot relegated to spreading the floor in the corner, a matchup you don't want Wiggins wasted on. But this might also be a part of a bigger problem for Steve Kerr. This decision might not actually be a good one. We're going to get back around to that. Over the last couple years, few struggles have been more prominent for Golden State than their struggle to get consistent rotational minutes out of their young talent, most of which they used top-end draft capital on, Jordan Poole in the final year of his rookie contract being the exception. Rookie contracts are powerful, especially to contenders. Them seeming more like a liability than an asset is not promising. It makes it hard to assume big jumps from guys like Moody and Kuminga, or expect the rookies to make any kind of significant contribution come the playoffs. If you're building a bull case for the Warriors, it has to center around that changing. Now, the Warriors are still clear contenders, but in order to make it back to the finals, it's probably best they do the exact opposite of what they did a year ago and they're currently saying they're about to do. Steve Kerr is well known for these constant tweaks to roles and really the entire rotation, but last season it reached its highest frequency and ultimately has to regress this year. We hinted with the Klay at the 4 situation, but it's starting to seem as if Kerr thinks there's always a change, always a decision from him that is the answer to what isn't working. He recently said that the rotation is going to be different every single night. This is a mindset that can and already has gone too far. Given the current landscape of the league and their position in that landscape, they've got to settle on a rotation. A lot of change is reasonable out the gate. Draymond's currently out. They need to figure out where Chris Paul fits into this group. But this can't be something they're still trying to figure out in May. Come the All-Star break, we should be seeing a rotation very, very similar to the one we're seeing in the playoffs. At the very least, there should be absolutely no, zero, nada, nothing done, no deviating from that starting unit when healthy. Again, the best starting lineup in the league. There's just no justification for doing that. Then you obviously want to give all these young guys minutes and opportunity during the regular season, but you can't give someone a 20-minute role all season, days before the playoffs start, and then have that same player warming the bench, especially in such a pivotal part of the rotation. If Kuminga was unplayable, why are you trying to figure out what to do about that once the playoffs have already started? In the regular season, rotations are deep and rightfully so. There will be minutes available for all these guys, all these young pieces. But leading up to the playoffs, those roles need to get defined. No more so than in the front court. Outside of the brief JaMychal Green experiment, they got nothing out of this part of the rotation. If that remains the case, they're going to be forced to live and die by these death lineups once again. The options there currently are Dario Saric, Jonathan Kuminga, and Trayce Jackson-Davis. That's it. Denver gives you a pretty good idea of what the Warriors need to potentially address here. They do something pretty similar with Jokic and Gordon that the Warriors do with Draymond and Looney. They manage to efficiently stack their minutes so that at all times at least one of them is at the 5. All times. But a massive difference between that duo and this one, solely speaking in regards to rotation, is that Jokic plays 33 minutes a night. In the playoffs, that goes up to nearly 40. This means those small ball lineups are really rare, really only when Jokic needs a quick breather. When that's the case, all you need is Jeff Green to give you some halfway serviceable minutes at the 4 briefly in between quarters. But for the Warriors, Kevon Looney doesn't go past 23 minutes a game, maybe 25 in the playoffs. This means for nearly half the game, because of how the Warriors have constructed their roster, they're forced into these small ball lineups. That's fine. You don't need 33 minutes out of Looney, but you can't look at the wings and forwards off the bench and think you need what the Nuggets got out of Jeff Green. They need legitimate production on both ends. They need someone there that's playing 20, 25 minutes nightly in the playoffs. Kuminga one night, Dario the other, Jackson Davis out of nowhere is a recipe to repeat the same exact disaster. Dario will seem like the safest option here, but he's someone only a year removed from tearing his ACL and unlikely capable of playing that level of minutes nightly, given the ability to play in various different lineup configurations that will be necessary. This is why most of the Warriors' upside this season is on one man's shoulders, Jonathan Kuminga. Wiggins and Klay right now are the only true wings on the roster, but because of how much space on the roster and the rotation is being taken up by guards, Wiggins is already spending half his time in the front court. Potentially, we're hearing that Klay is about to do the same. If Kuminga can get on the court, you have someone that potentially, emphasis on potentially, can play with Wiggins and Draymond and Looney, Wiggins and Looney. No other player even has the chance to do that, at least effectively. And they absolutely need someone who can. But potential is just that. Few teams have higher expectations. They're not going to be able to play him just for rotational reasons. He has to take a jump for him to see the court in May. All the defensive tools are there. The frame is there. The potential is there. The defense is not. To play in the front court, the rebounding isn't there. To play on the wing, the offense is unreliable and inconsistent. The latter's fine. The others are a non-negotiable. It really isn't unrealistic for him to take a huge leap. This is an elite level talent, a former top recruit, a former top pick in the draft. A Jordan Poole-esque breakout is not out of the cards. And in the event of something like that, the scenario completely changes. The Warriors should have as good as odds as anyone. And while it's just the preseason, one preseason game at that, you've got to feel good about him kicking things off with 24 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, shooting 4 for 8 from 3. A great start to this season, but remember the growth that's really game-changing here won't be as a scorer. In a perfect world, Chris Paul and Kuminga dominate the bench minutes in May, and it's that 8th spot where Kerr gets his coaching fix. That's the part he gets to change night to night, but still within a consistent pool of players. As of right now, you would think Gary Payton and Saric. You see bigger or smaller roles for the two based on how much size the matchup demands. Hopefully Moody, Jackson Davis, or Podziemski play their way into playoff roles. But this isn't something that should cause all the minutes to be spread out. In the event of something like that happening, it should come at the cost of someone previously mentioned. If the consequences of that are detrimental to a locker room, you make a decision similar to the one Denver did with Bones Highland. If Kuminga doesn't improve, or once again is absent from the rotation for the right reasons, and the team doesn't manage to address that quickly well before the playoffs, they're going to face a nearly identical situation that they did a year ago and ultimately was their downfall. Their Andre Iguodala role, which was later taken over by Otto Porter in 2022, today is completely absent. The role was handed to DiVincenzo a year ago, but his lack of size didn't bring them nearly the lineup flexibility needed. This season, he's not even there anymore, and the kicker, he hasn't been replaced. If you're a Warriors fan, don't get caught up in the quantity, listing off 8 players outside the starters that can do this or that, have this skill set, this potential, this value. In the Warriors' 2022 championship run, 3 guys came off the bench that got more than 10 minutes. Right now, you know you have Chris Paul there, who's an upgrade from Poole, but again, comes with 0 guarantees. These other 2 spots right here, they're completely unanswered, and that cannot remain the case. You do not want this part of the bench spread out between 5 players, most of which are probably guards based on this roster construction. Their success with all these small lineups had a huge impact on the historic run they're on right now, but it might have caused them to go too far. The death lineup's gone from an option to at times the only option. The near-death lineup really might be the best way to put it beyond their historic age. The neglect of key aspects of the rotation caused by its success might have the Warriors dynasty nearing death much sooner than it has to. Right now, coming into this season, there is too much focus on Chris Paul. It would be nearly impossible for any lineup configuration with him to top the present starters at a large sample. Actually, that would just be legitimately impossible. He is an upgrade to Jordan Poole in that role. He's a better version of what Kyle Lowry was for the Heat this past year, plain and simple. He isn't unleashing something out of this Warriors offense we've never seen before. You know the starting lineup can compete with the best of them. They now have a great sixth man and lead playmaker past Draymond, but they have from now till May to keep this core healthy, find and commit to those 7th and 8th spots in the rotation, the same guys that will hold those spots for 90% of the playoffs. Just having the best starting lineup simply won't cut it. We already saw that.